The United States makes the UN work when it wants it to work. And that is exactly the way it should be, because the only question to the United States is what's in our national interest.
My name is John, and the International Criminal Court is now in session. It is May 7th, 2025, and we are once again going to talk about the situation in Ukraine, so let's not waste any time and get into it. First of all, we are going to talk about the situation in the Kherson Oblast. The Russians have reportedly been advancing outside of the city of Kherson, which is the provincial capital of the Kherson Oblast, which Ukraine as of today controls, though Russia still claims it to be part of their sovereign territory. And from what I understand, the Russians have apparently claimed control, at least that's what pro-Russian Telegram channels are saying, of these islands here that are alongside the Dnieper River. And if these reports were to be true, then it wouldn't shock me if later down the line that the Russians do try to launch a cranky like operation on this side of the Dnieper River, which would give them the opportunity to perhaps recapture Kherson, which they lost in November 2022 as a result of Ukraine's counteroffensive there, but also it would also give them the opportunity to advance towards Mykolaiv Oblast, which is here. There's also reports speculating too by pro-Ukrainian channels that the Russians are going to launch an offensive on not just Kherson Oblast, well, the parts that are under Ukrainian control, but also on Mykolaiv too. And they're going to do this by utilizing hundreds of speedboats or something to conduct an amphibious landing somewhere in this area. But I am not buying it, and until we have enough proof of such things happening, I'm not going to really believe any of those things. Now, before I go any further, I want to talk a bit about the political side of things. Apparently, General Kellogg, who is like one of Donald Trump's lead like diplomats or negotiators on the war in Ukraine, proposed the idea that the Ukrainians would hand over the city of Pokrovsk and Myrnograd to the Russians, along with the city of Kherson. But in return, the Ukrainians would retake control over the city of Novokakhovka, Energodar, which is in the Zaporozhye Oblast, and lastly, the town of Lishki, which is right here, right alongside the Dnieper River. I think this idea by Kellogg is absolutely retarded. It makes absolutely no sense. Sorry. I'm a little tired, by the way, as you can tell by my voice, but I digress. I think it's a very dumb idea because you're asking the Ukrainians to give up, like, one side of the Dnieper River, like, in the Kherson region, yet you're telling the Russians to give up their side, too, like in Energodar and Novokakhovka. Are you kidding me? It's almost as if they're not even trying at this point. Like, they know the talks between Russia and Ukraine are dead, and if anything, they're just making fun of it at this point. But I don't know. We got some very stupid people right now in Washington regarding this war, and yeah, it's not really going anywhere, if you ask me, as of right now. Nothing really changed in the Zaporozhye direction, so we can really forget about that. And in the southern Donetsk direction, the Russians have reportedly started advancing from Novosilka, which is outside of the town of Velika Novosilka, which was captured by the Russians earlier in 2025. And they are advancing on the villages of Zelenie Pule and Novopol, right here. And these are both on the border with not just Zaporozhye Oblast, but also DNEPROPETROVSK. If Zelenie Pule and Novopol were to fall, then it's just empty fields separating them and the Dnipropetrovsk region, which is a place that the Russians have barely touched throughout the 3-year conflict in Ukraine. Now, of course, I do think before entering Dnieper region, they do have to capture the village of Rivka, but as I said, after you take these two villages here, there's not really much separating the Russians and entering Dnepropetrovsk region. I mean, hell, like after they take this, they can then just enter the province here and then start taking all these villages, and I guess maybe somewhere down the line proclaim it to be part of Russia proper. But time will tell if that's actually going to materialize. But I may want to keep an eye out on this direction because of how close they are to Dnepropetrovsk in this direction. The Russians have also started their push into Bogatyr, and as far as I know, the Russians seem to be having success, and I heard the Ukrainians are in big trouble here because there's a river crossing here that is threatening their ability to enter the village to begin with. But also, the fact is that they only have pretty much only one way out that isn't a bridge, and that's of course this road here that leads out and eventually into Dnepropetrovsk region. And yeah, so apparently Ukrainians are reportedly already folding back in this village, but we don't have any confirmation yet, but apparently they are. And just north of Bogatyr is the village of Oleksivka. And if these two villages were to fall, then again, nothing's really going to stop the Russians from entering Dnipro region. And speaking of which, the Russians have made a push. Recently, they've made a sizable push lately towards the Dnepropetrovsk Oblast borders with Donetsk region. They have seized complete control over the village of Kotlyrovka, and yeah, this was basically the last village, at least in this direction, before you enter the Dnipro region. And with the capture of Kotlyrovka, the Russians now can just literally take one of these tree lines here and proclaim their entry into Dnipro region, which would be, of course, a propaganda victory for the Russians. A very much needed propaganda victory after Ukrainians kept on messing around in Kursk and in the Belgrade region, which I will talk about at the near end of the video. But yeah, with the fall of Kotlyrovka, sorry about that, I wouldn't be shocked if these trio of villages here were to fall sooner than we expect. Troitsky, Hurikove, and Bondanivka. I honestly don't know how much longer these villages are going to hold now that the northern flanks are completely compromised, but I wouldn't be shocked if they were to fall sometime either this month or in June. And if these villages were to be taken here, then Oleksivka is effectively in a cauldron, especially if Bogatyr falls, and the Ukrainians will have no choice but to fall back into the Dnepropetrovsk region, which would be a major catastrophe for the armed forces of Ukraine, who are already struggling to stop the Russian advances in multiple parts of the front. And apparently there's also a report that the Russians are also advancing in the direction of the villages of Novoserhivka, and are also trying to clear out the village of Novoalexandrivka. And there's also now a report speculating, when geolocations provide, that the Russians are advancing outside of the village of Udachny, like here in this area here. And if this were to be confirmed, then this would be a complete disaster, because Udachny has been holding on for the last couple of months or so. And if this village were to fall, literally to the Russians, then again, nothing's going to stop Russia from wanting to enter Dnepropetrovsk region and essentially threatening the town of Mazova here, which is the first sizable settlement that the Russians could aim to take. And also, the Russians have recaptured the village of Kotline, which was mostly recaptured by the Ukrainians during March or April of 2025. But Russians have retaken it, and the Ukrainians' counteroffensive across the entire Pokrovsk direction has completely failed, and the Russians are now back on the offensive once more. There's a report now that Ukrainians have also now been completely pushed out of Shevchenko too, and also the Russian Ministry of Defense has also claimed the capture of the village of Lisovka. And if this were to be true, then all there is just a Suki-Yar, and then Mayanograd would then be threatened. And going into the eastern flanks of the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians have advanced into the village of Myro-Lyubivka and have also taken most, if not like half, of the village of Yelizavivka, and are also now advancing towards the village of Malinivka as well, and have also reportedly captured the village of Novolinivka too. And apparently most of like the high ground areas are around these areas here, and there's not really a lot of people here. So I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of May or perhaps sometime in June, pretty much everything here, like going from like Pokrovsk all the way up to the village of Barostok, which is outside of the city of Konstantinovka, would come all under Russian control. The Battle of Toretsk is also finishing up with the Russians clearing out the Terrakons, but also along with trying to clear out the outskirts of Toretsk too, at least from the northern and eastern directions. But the southern flanks have not yet been, or should I say western flanks have not yet been completely cleared yet. So there's still a lot of work to do for the Russians there. Russians are also continuing to advance towards the village of Alexandropol, which I'm expecting it to fall without that much of a fight. And yeah, Toretsk is pretty much under partial Russian control at this point, though Ukrainians have been trying to counterattack into the city once more, but it's obviously going to fail at this point. And Russians have been advancing outside of the outskirts of the village of Dalivka and also Dalivka. Literally, they're the same name. Dalivka 1 and Dalivka 2. Dachny is also pretty much under Russian control at this point, so we can forget about that. That one's a wrap. And then going up north, we have the situation in Chasiv Yar. The Russians have apparently started advancing towards this hilly, like, chalk area here. And from what I understand, the Russians have taken partial control of it. And if this were to be confirmed, then Russians are basically overlooking the entire town of Chasiv Yar. And there's also a report, though not confirmed yet, that the Russians have taken most, if not put the commie block areas within central Chasiv Yar into either a gray zone or under their control. Time will tell if this is true, but for now, the Russians do control the outskirts of Chasiv Yar and have effectively encircled the center part of it, literally, they literally put it into a cauldron. It is getting uglier by the day, and I wouldn't be surprised if sometime during summer, Chasiv Yar completely falls to Russia, and then we see the full-blown push towards the city of Konstantinovka. And as I said, I don't know, considering the geography, that the Ukrainians are going to put on a fight, but if they were to, I think they'd be very stupid, because this is lowland areas, while Chasiv Yar is in a hilly area, and the Russians are then just going to bomb the living shit out of the city, which would effectively make it easier for the Russians to take over in the distant future. Now, going into the Siversk direction, things have actually been happening here as of late, believe it or not. The Russians have advanced into the ruined village of Hryhorivka and have apparently taken partial control of it. And they have also cleared out the areas west of Bilogorovka here, and have now entered the Donetsk Oblast from this direction. And I wouldn't be surprised if this is a result of Alexander Sanchik's directions that he's been taking in when it comes to the Siversk front. And for those who don't know who Sanchik is, he was the general responsible for cracking the Ugledar front for the Russians, which was a major pain in the ass for them in the last couple of years or so. But thanks to him, that problem has now been solved, and he's now hoping to recreate his magic in the Siversk area. The Russians have also advanced considerably in the Liman direction, and they're continuing to do so, but there has been no attacks toward Liman yet, though there are reports that the Russians are taking parts of northern Torske under their control, but again, we don't have much confirmation on that yet. Nove has been secured, and Russians are continuing the advance towards the Kharkiv region, and also towards clearing the rest of the Lugansk region too. They hope to recapture the whole thing by summer. Russians have also completed their complete recapture, by the way, of the village of Stepi, and that's about it. The Kupiansk direction is all but dead. It's literally basically back to the status quo as it was during late 2024. with the exception, of course, with the capture of Jarizove, and of course Lazova too, being under Russian control too. So the Kupiansk direction, while not really too active as of late, is favoring Russia more and more every day. Nothing really much going on in the Lugansk direction, though there is a report that the Russians are advancing in this part of the town here. And yeah, it's a stalemate, though it's obvious at this point that the Russians have the advantage in Volchansk, and also nothing going on in the Lipsy direction. It looks like Ukrainians have given up there as well. Now for the Kursk/Belgrade direction, the Ukrainians, as you all know, like not long after they failed in Kursk region altogether, they tried to attack Belgrade region, and they nearly took the villages of Popovka and Dimidovka, but they have not been successful in doing so, and they have been forced to fold back from these areas. And they have also been trying to attack the village of Terikino, which is here, which is like one of the largest villages on the border with Ukraine other than Suja. But honestly, I think the Ukrainians are being stupid, and I wouldn't be too surprised if this counteroffensive or this offensive by the Ukrainians into Kursk fails too. I mean, literally, it's too predictable at this point. And what was once the Sumy region, I mean, sorry for spoiling the obvious, what was once the Suja direction is now the Sumy direction. Part 2. The Russians now control a decent chunk. Like, they control a decent amount of the Sumy Oblast, like around like 90 or so square kilometers, and they have fully captured the villages of Basovka, Novinke, Zorovka, Vasilivka, and have captured so far half of the village of Bilovdove. Sorry if I incorrectly pronounced that, but it's Bilovodi. Yeah, Bilovodovi. Sorry about that. But yeah, the Russians now have a decent chunk of Sumy under their control. I think it's the equivalent to the size of the Lipsy pocket in the Kharkiv direction. But Russians are definitely going to expand that buffer zone as time goes by during the summer. And I wouldn't be surprised that once they clear out Belgrade region, they're definitely going to advance throughout this whole area here and try to turn it into a major clusterfuck for the armed forces of Ukraine. And speaking of which, I heard reports that the Ukrainians are sending a lot of guys right now into the Sumy region to counter the Russians' efforts in Sumy Oblast, but I think they're going to struggle throughout summer. I mean, the climate is overwhelmingly in favor of Russia, and I mean, yeah, support from the United States is clearly dwindling at the moment. Now, before I get going, I want to talk about a bit about like the upcoming V-Day parade, Victory Day parade in Moscow. Now, as all of you know by now, the Russians love to host this parade every once a year, which would be May 9th, regardless of what day of the week it is. The parade is going to be held in Moscow Oblast, and it will be done on Red Square. And as far as I know, this is going to be the biggest, literally the biggest V-Day parade in years. Literally the largest one before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You're going to have people like from like all sorts of like places like within Europe, Asia, and Africa all coming. And also the Americas too, all coming to this parade in Moscow. You got the president of China, Brazil. You got the president of Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Belarus. You have the president of Azerbaijan, the dictator of Azerbaijan, the prime minister of Armenia. You then got president of Ethiopia also coming to town too. You also got the Myanmar's military junta like leader also coming. You have the Secretary General of the Communist Party of Vietnam also coming to the Red Square Parade. I mean, there's a lot of interesting people coming to this parade, also including the heads of state of both Serbia and Hungary. Oh, also Slovakia too. So that's 3 European countries, and also The head of state of Bosnia, too, are also attending the parade. Like, there is a shit ton of people who are coming to this parade. And the government of Volodymyr Zelensky was actually making threats that they would go after this parade. Like, they would attack it, which most people know, like, from a common sense perspective, would be absolutely stupid, because then it would make Ukraine look no better than Russia. And by committing an act of terrorism against all those world leaders who I just mentioned, they would effectively be dragging those countries into the war. And as all of you know, Ukraine is already having problems enough, like enough problems. I mean, literally, if you attacked literally the president of China, Xi Jinping, or the guy who's leading Vietnam now, Ukraine is cooked. They are screwed. They are no match for those countries. They have more manpower that they're willing to send if their countries were to get dragged into it, just because of a little man's ego in Kiev, but also because of some lunatic nationalist that happened to also be in charge of the government in Ukraine. But thanks to Donald Trump, it doesn't look like this attack is going to happen, and the parade is going to go through without an issue. I mean, I hope. It's very unlikely anything's going to happen, though I've seen a lot of NAFO accounts hope that an attack would happen. But again, it's not realistic. It would be very stupid if they did do such an attack. But if they did, though, I mean, I would respect them a little bit, because it's a very bold thing to do. But oh my goodness, they would be asking to be completely wiped out by the Russians at that point if they attacked this parade. And not to mention, there's going to be a lot of troops also taking part from all sorts of countries, including the ones I mentioned earlier, including like China and Vietnam, Myanmar, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, I think. I mean, like 9 like foreign countries other than Russia are taking part in the Victory Day parade in Moscow, in Red Square. And also, good news, if you're a tank nerd, the Russians are going to bring back their tanks. For the first time in 3 years, since the start of the war in Ukraine, the Russians are going to actually proudly show off their tanks. Hopefully that gets you all hyped up. And before I get going, I should mention that I will do a live stream of the Red Square Parade in Moscow on May 9th, which will be, of course, midnight my time. But it's going to be morning, like breakfast time over there. And yeah, it's going to be a fun stream. I'm going to be stream sniping, just to be clear, a infamous NAFO account who's going to be definitely soy-jacking and making fun of the Russians for having crappy parades in the last couple of years. But if you consider the political and security implications, they had no choice but to bog down the parade. They already canceled a V-Day parade in Crimea, which obviously they should do. But I wonder why they haven't canceled one yet in Krasnodar, let alone Rostov-on-Don. I mean, time will tell if they'll do that. But for now, though, the parade in Moscow is good to go. I'm not expecting any attacks on it, even though the Ukrainians are capable of doing it. But also, let's be honest, it would just be absolutely stupid. So, yeah. So that's all I got to say for today's video, everybody. I hope you all enjoyed it, found it entertaining, let alone informative. And I'll see you all next time. So take care, everybody, and peace out. Bye.